In the early years of the Cold War, as the world was still sorting through the wreckage of the Second World War, Iran emerged as a quiet but critical fault line in the global struggle between power, ideology, and control. And at the center of this struggle stood Mohammad Mossadegh, a frail-looking, fiercely principled nationalist whose rise to power in 1951 signaled a direct challenge to the old imperial order that had dominated Iran for decades, because Mossadegh was not a revolutionary in the Marxist sense, nor a Soviet proxy, but a constitutionalist who believed that Iran's resources, especially its oil, should belong to the Iranian people rather than to foreign corporations that extracted immense wealth while leaving the country poor, unstable, and dependent. And this belief collided head-on with British interests embodied by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which controlled Iran's oil industry under concession agreements that granted Iran only a fraction of the profits, while London reaped the strategic and economic rewards, using Iranian oil to fuel its post-war recovery and maintain its global influence. And when Mossadegh moved to nationalize the oil industry, he did so legally through Iran's parliament, framing the act not as anti-Western, but as an assertion of sovereignty consistent with international law. Yet, to British officials, this was an intolerable precedent, because if Iran succeeded, other resource-rich nations might follow, threatening the entire structure of Western economic dominance in the developing world. And so, from the moment nationalization passed, Britain moved to strangle Iran economically through embargoes, legal action, and diplomatic pressure, while portraying Mossadegh as reckless, unstable, and incapable of governing. But what truly transformed this regional dispute into a Cold War flashpoint was the growing fear in Washington that Iran, weakened by economic warfare and internal unrest, might fall into the orbit of the Soviet Union, whose borders lay just to the north and whose influence loomed large in American strategic thinking at a time when the memory of Eastern Europe's rapid Soviet consolidation was still fresh. And this fear was magnified by the presence of the Tudeh Party, a legal and organized communist movement in Iran that had real support among workers and intellectuals. Even though Mossadegh himself was firmly anti-communist and had repeatedly acted to limit Tudeh's influence, but nuance was rarely rewarded in the early Cold War, and in the binary logic that increasingly governed American foreign policy, any instability near Soviet borders was interpreted as an opportunity for Moscow, regardless of local realities. And this mindset hardened after the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952, whose administration brought with it a more aggressive national security team, including John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, both of whom viewed the Cold War as a moral and existential struggle in which compromise with nationalism that threatened Western interests was indistinguishable from appeasement of communism. And it was within this climate that British intelligence, having failed to remove Mossadegh on its own after being expelled from Iran, turned decisively to the United States for help, framing the Iranian crisis not as a colonial dispute, but as an urgent matter of global security, warning that Mossadegh's continued defiance would collapse Iran's economy, empower the Tudeh Party, and open the door to a Soviet-aligned government controlling one of the world's most strategically vital oil reserves. And although many American diplomats on the ground initially disagreed with this assessment, arguing that Mossadegh represented a democratic alternative to extremism, their voices were gradually drowned out by the broader Cold War narrative that demanded decisive action. And so, in 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency, working closely with Britain's MI6, authorized a covert operation designed not to influence Iranian politics subtly, but to overthrow a sitting prime minister through psychological warfare, political manipulation, and street-level chaos, an operation that would later be known as Operation Ajax. And at its core, the plan relied on exploiting Iran's fragile political balance, its constitutional monarchy, and the young, insecure figure of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who technically held the authority to dismiss Mossadegh, but lacked the confidence and popular support to do so without foreign backing. And CIA planners understood that the Shah's signature on a decree removing Mossadegh would provide a veneer of legality to what was, in reality, a foreign-engineered coup. And so enormous effort was spent persuading, pressuring, and reassuring the Shah, who vacillated repeatedly, fearful that if the plot failed, he would be overthrown or killed, while at the same time CIA operatives on the ground began shaping the information environment inside Iran, bribing newspaper editors, politicians, clerics, and military officers, spreading rumors that Mossadegh was secretly aligned with communists or intended to abolish the monarchy, and funding staged protests that could be blamed on the Tudeh party in order to frighten the middle class, religious leaders, and the army into believing that chaos and atheistic revolution were imminent unless Mossadegh was removed. And this manipulation of perception was not a side element of the operation, but its central weapon, reflecting a new Cold War doctrine in which control of narratives and mass psychology was as important as tanks or troops. And yet, despite months of preparation, the operation's initial phase collapsed in dramatic fashion. When the Shah's decree was delivered prematurely, Mossadegh exposed the plot, and the Shah fled Iran in panic, leaving behind what appeared to be a failed coup and a strengthened prime minister whose supporters poured into the streets, celebrating the apparent defeat of foreign interference. And for a brief moment, it seemed as though Operation Ajax had ended in humiliation. But the reality was more complex and more dangerous, because the very chaos unleashed by the attempt, combined with continued economic pressure and political polarization, created conditions that CIA operatives quickly moved to exploit, doubling down on street mobilization, encouraging rival factions, criminal gangs, and elements within the military to act independently, transforming Tehran into a volatile battlefield of rumor, fear, and violence. And this escalation would soon culminate in a decisive reversal that permanently altered Iran's political trajectory and set in motion consequences that would echo across the Middle East for decades, demonstrating that the Cold War was not only fought along borders and through treaties, but through covert interventions that reshaped nations from within while remaining officially invisible. And as Operation Ajax moved into its final and most consequential phase, the lines between internal dissent and foreign orchestration blurred completely, leaving behind a legacy that would define U.S.-Iranian relations long after the immediate crisis had passed. As the dust settled from the apparent failure of the first attempt to remove Mossadegh and the Shah's sudden flight from the country, Tehran entered a liminal moment where victory and vulnerability coexisted uneasily, because while Mossadegh appeared triumphant, the structures of power beneath him were fracturing under immense strain. The economy was still strangled by the oil embargo. Government revenues were collapsing. Inflation and unemployment were rising. And the very democratic coalition that had brought him to power was splintering into competing factions that no longer trusted one another. And it was in this unstable atmosphere that the architects of Operation Ajax made their most consequential decision, choosing not to abort the mission, but to intensify it, believing that disorder itself could be weaponized. And at the center of this renewed effort was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the CIA operative coordinating events on the ground, who understood that the coup would not succeed through legality or persuasion alone, but through momentum, spectacle, and the manipulation of fear. And so, money flowed more freely than before into the hands of intermediaries who could mobilize crowds, sway military units, and amplify rumors, turning Tehran's streets into a stage where confusion could be mistaken for popular will, and gangs were paid to riot under false banners. Newspapers printed fabricated stories portraying Mossadegh as anti-Islamic and tyrannical, and clerical figures were encouraged to denounce him from pulpits as a threat to religion and order. Not because these claims were grounded in reality, but because repetition and chaos could erode public confidence faster than reasoned debate. And crucially, the operation shifted its focus toward the Iranian military, an institution that had remained largely passive during the first phase, but whose loyalty would ultimately decide the outcome, as officers were bribed, reassured, or intimidated into believing that Mossadegh's fall was inevitable and that siding with him would place them on the wrong side of history. And in this atmosphere of mounting pressure, the Shah's earlier decree dismissing Mossadegh, though initially ineffective, was resurrected and reframed as a legitimate act of constitutional authority, allowing coup organizers to present the unfolding unrest not as a rebellion, but as the restoration of lawful order. And on August 19th, 1953, this narrative collided with brute force as pro-Shah military units moved decisively, seizing key intersections, radio stations, and government buildings, while Mossadegh's supporters, leaderless and uncertain after days of confusion, failed to mount a coordinated defense. And what followed was not a single dramatic battle, but a rapid cascade of defections, as soldiers who had hesitated hours earlier now acted once they believed the tide had turned, and Mossadegh himself, isolated in his residence, refused to order violent resistance against the army, a decision consistent with his constitutional principles but disastrous in a moment that rewarded ruthlessness over restraint. And by the end of the day, his government had collapsed. His house lay in ruins after being shelled, and he was taken into custody, while the Shah, who had been watching events anxiously from abroad, prepared to return as the undisputed ruler of Iran. And the speed of this reversal stunned observers both inside and outside the country, because it revealed how shallow Iran's democratic institutions had been once foreign pressure, economic warfare, and internal fragmentation converged. And in the immediate aftermath, the coup was presented to the Iranian public as a spontaneous uprising against mismanagement and chaos. While internationally, it was framed as a necessary intervention that had prevented a communist takeover, a claim that would be repeated for decades, despite the absence of evidence that Iran was on the brink of Soviet alignment. And for Washington, the operation was hailed as a triumph of covert action, reinforcing the belief that secret interventions could reshape foreign governments at relatively low cost and with plausible deniability, a lesson that would profoundly influence U.S. policy throughout the Cold War. But the costs, though delayed, were real and corrosive, because the restoration of the Shah did not bring stability through legitimacy, but through repression. As political parties were crushed, dissent was criminalized, and security services were expanded with Western assistance to ensure that no future Mossadegh could emerge. And while oil production resumed under new agreements more favorable to Western interests, the sense of betrayal among Iranians deepened, especially among nationalists and intellectuals who had believed that constitutional democracy could coexist with independence. And this betrayal was not abstract, but personal, as Mossadegh was tried, imprisoned, and then confined to house arrest for the rest of his life, becoming a living symbol of a path Iran might have taken but was denied. And over time, the memory of 1953 hardened into a narrative of humiliation and foreign domination, that transcended political factions, embedding itself in Iran's collective consciousness as proof that external powers would not tolerate genuine sovereignty if it conflicted with strategic or economic priorities. And this legacy would resurface repeatedly in moments of crisis, shaping attitudes toward the United States and Britain long after the Cold War context that justified the coup had faded. And for the CIA, the apparent success of Operation Ajax contributed to an institutional confidence that would later prove dangerous, encouraging similar operations elsewhere without sufficient regard for local complexities or long-term consequences. And in this sense, Iran, in 1953, was not an isolated episode, but a template, demonstrating how fragile post-colonial states could be manipulated through a combination of economic pressure, psychological operations, and selective violence. And yet beneath the strategic calculations and operational details lay a deeper irony, because the coup that was justified as a defense against communism ultimately destroyed one of the Middle East's most promising democratic experiments, replacing it with an authoritarian regime whose survival depended on repression rather than consent. And as the Shah consolidated power in the years that followed, supported by Western governments that valued stability over democracy, the seeds of future upheaval were quietly planted, ensuring that the apparent victory of Operation Ajax would, in time, transform into a strategic and moral liability, whose repercussions would extend far beyond Iran's borders and far beyond the lifespan of the Cold War itself. With Mossadegh removed and the Shah restored, the immediate phase of Operation Ajax concluded. But the deeper transformation of Iran was only beginning, because power returned not to constitutional balance, but to a monarchy increasingly dependent on foreign backing and internal coercion. And in the months following August 1953, the Shah moved systematically to neutralize any remaining centers of opposition, dissolving political coalitions that had once supported him, sidelining parliament, and reshaping the state around a centralized executive authority that no longer tolerated dissent as a legitimate expression of national will. And this consolidation was not improvised, but carefully guided by Western advisors who believed that stability in a strategically vital region required firm control rather than pluralism. And so Iran's security apparatus expanded rapidly, culminating in the creation and empowerment of SAVAK, an internal security and intelligence organization trained and assisted by American and Israeli counterparts, tasked with identifying, monitoring, and eliminating political threats before they could coalesce into organized resistance. And under SAVAK's watchful presence, political life narrowed, newspapers were censored, activists were imprisoned or forced into exile, and the memory of Mossadegh's government was deliberately suppressed, not erased entirely, but reframed as a cautionary tale about chaos and vulnerability. While official narratives emphasized the Shah as the guarantor of modernization, independence, and national unity, even as his legitimacy rested increasingly on force rather than popular consent. And at the international level, the coup was quietly folded into the mythology of Cold War necessity, because for policymakers in Washington, it appeared to validate a powerful idea that covert action could achieve strategic objectives without the political costs of overt military intervention, an idea that would shape U.S. behavior from Latin America to Southeast Asia. But beneath this apparent success lay unresolved contradictions, because the very act of overthrowing a democratically elected leader in the name of anti-communism undermined the credibility of American rhetoric about freedom and self-determination, a contradiction that adversaries would exploit and allies would privately acknowledge but rarely confront openly. And in Iran, this contradiction manifested as a widening gap between rapid economic modernization and political exclusion, as oil revenues increased and ambitious development projects transformed cities and infrastructure. Yet the benefits were unevenly distributed and accompanied by social dislocation, rural migration, and cultural anxiety, especially among religious communities and traditional elites who felt alienated by the pace and character of change imposed from above. And while the Shah portrayed himself as a reformer steering Iran toward a prosperous future aligned with the West, many Iranians experienced his rule as a narrowing corridor where obedience was rewarded and dissent punished. A perception sharpened by the knowledge, whispered but widely understood, that his power had been restored not by popular uprising, but by foreign intervention. And this knowledge mattered because it infused political opposition with a moral dimension that transcended policy disagreements, framing resistance not merely as opposition to a ruler, but as opposition to an entire system perceived as imposed and sustained from outside. And as years passed, this sentiment did not dissipate, but accumulated, passed quietly through families, universities, mosques, and exile communities, becoming a shared memory of grievance that would later provide ideological fuel for revolutionary movements. And yet during the 1950s and 1960s, this deeper undercurrent remained largely invisible to Western observers, who focused instead on surface indicators of stability, such as military strength, economic growth, and diplomatic alignment. And for the United States, Iran became a pillar of its Middle Eastern strategy, a regional ally positioned along the southern flank of the Soviet Union, hosting listening posts, cooperating in intelligence gathering, and projecting influence in a volatile region. And this strategic value reinforced a pattern of tolerance toward repression, because so long as Iran remained aligned with Western interests and resistant to Soviet influence, concerns about internal political freedoms were subordinated to broader geopolitical priorities, and this trade-off, repeated across the Cold War world, revealed the limits of ideology when confronted with perceived necessity. And it was in this context that the memory of Operation Ajax receded from official discourse, becoming classified, denied, or euphemized as internal Iranian developments, even as its consequences unfolded in plain sight. And for Iranians, the silence itself became another form of confirmation, because the absence of acknowledgement suggested not innocence, but indifference, reinforcing the belief that great powers acted with impunity while smaller nations bore the costs. And over time, this perception hardened into a foundational narrative of mistrust toward Western intentions, particularly those of the United States, whose influence had supplanted Britain's as the dominant external force in Iran. And this mistrust was not confined to radical elements, but extended across political and social strata, shaping how events were interpreted and remembered. And when later crises emerged, from regional conflicts to internal protests, they were filtered through the lens of 1953, understood not as isolated episodes, but as continuations of a longer struggle over sovereignty, dignity, and control. And in this way, Operation Ajax cast a shadow far longer than its planners anticipated, because it demonstrated that even successful covert interventions could generate long-term instability by undermining the very legitimacy that stable governance requires. And as the Cold War progressed, the Shah's Iran would stand as both a strategic asset and a latent vulnerability, its apparent strength masking unresolved tensions that no amount of intelligence surveillance or military hardware could fully contain. And while policymakers in Washington moved on to new crises and new theaters, the consequences of 1953 continued to accumulate quietly within Iranian society, setting the stage for a reckoning that would eventually challenge not only the Shah's rule, but the entire architecture of U.S. influence in the region, revealing that the true cost of Operation Ajax was not paid immediately, but deferred. waiting patiently for the moment when suppressed grievances could no longer be contained by fear, modernization, or external support. As the decades advanced and the Cold War hardened into a global system of alliances, proxy conflicts, and ideological surveillance, the Iranian state that emerged from the ruins of 1953 became increasingly defined by contradiction, presenting itself outwardly as modern, stable, and indispensable to Western strategy, while inwardly resting on a brittle foundation of coercion and unresolved legitimacy. And this contradiction was sustained in part by the strategic environment of the time, because the United States and its allies viewed the Middle East less as a collection of societies with internal dynamics than as a chessboard whose value lay in oil flows, military positioning, and the containment of Soviet influence. And within this framework, Iran's role was clear, serving as a buffer state along the Soviet Union's southern frontier and a reliable partner in intelligence gathering, arms purchases, and regional power projection. And this role brought immense resources into the Shah's hands, allowing him to build one of the largest militaries in the region and pursue ambitious modernization programs that reshaped Iran's economy and urban landscape. But these developments did not erase the memory of how his power had been restored, and instead, they deepened the divide between the state and large segments of society who viewed modernization without political participation as another form of domination, this time internal, but still inseparable from foreign influence. And while economic growth created new elites tied to the regime, it also generated new grievances. As inequality widened, traditional livelihoods were disrupted, and political expression remained tightly controlled, and the security services, expanded and refined over time, became both the regime's shield and its most visible symbol of repression, reinforcing a climate in which fear substituted for consent. And this atmosphere shaped the evolution of opposition movements that learned, through bitter experience, that reform within the system was nearly impossible, pushing dissent either underground or into exile. Where memories of Mossadegh's overthrow were preserved and reinterpreted as evidence that peaceful constitutional change had been deliberately foreclosed by foreign intervention, and this interpretation mattered because it reframed the meaning of resistance, transforming it from a debate over policy into a struggle over national dignity and historical justice. And as the Cold War progressed, this narrative was quietly reinforced by global events that exposed the selective nature of Western support for democracy, from coups and interventions elsewhere to alliances with authoritarian regimes deemed strategically useful. And each of these episodes echoed the lesson of 1953, that sovereignty was conditional and could be revoked when it conflicted with external priorities. And within Iran, this lesson was internalized across generations, passed down not through official histories, but through personal stories, whispered conversations, and cultural memory, ensuring that the events of the coup remained alive even as they were officially denied or minimized. And when protests erupted periodically in later years, they were often met with force rather than dialogue, reinforcing the sense that the political system had no legitimate mechanisms for accountability. And this cycle of repression and resistance gradually radicalized opposition currents, creating space for ideologies that rejected not only the Shah's rule, but the entire Western-aligned order that sustained it. And it was here that the long shadow of Operation Ajax became unmistakable, because the coup had not only removed a leader, but altered the trajectory of Iranian political culture, teaching both rulers and opponents that power was ultimately decided not by ballots or debate, but by force and manipulation. A lesson that would resurface dramatically when the balance of fear finally shifted decades later. And from the perspective of American policymakers, the irony was profound because the intervention justified as a means of preventing instability and communist influence, ultimately produced a partner whose survival required ever greater repression and whose collapse would later deliver one of the most significant strategic shocks to U.S. interests in the region. And yet during the height of the Cold War, this possibility was largely dismissed, overshadowed by short-term indicators of alignment and control, and this pattern reflected a broader tendency within Cold War strategy to privilege immediate containment over long-term political legitimacy, a tendency that Operation Ajax exemplified with unusual clarity and, as archival evidence slowly emerged in later years, confirming the extent of foreign involvement in the coup. The historical record aligned with what many Iranians had long believed, validating grievances that had been dismissed as propaganda or conspiracy, and this validation did not heal wounds but harden them, because acknowledgement without accountability reinforced the perception that great powers could intervene decisively in the fate of smaller nations without bearing responsibility for the outcomes. And thus, the legacy of 1953 extended beyond Iran itself, shaping debates about sovereignty, intervention, and the ethics of covert action within the international system, demonstrating that the Cold War's most consequential battles were often fought not in open warfare, but in the quiet subversion of political processes, whose destruction carried costs that could not be measured immediately. And as Iran moved closer to the breaking point in the late 20th century, the coup that had once been celebrated as a strategic success re-emerged as a foundational trauma. Its significance magnified not only by what it accomplished in the short term, but by what it foreclosed, leaving behind a sense of unfinished history that would eventually demand resolution on terms far removed from those imagined by the planners of Operation Ajax. By the late 1970s, the accumulated pressures unleashed and shaped by the events of 1953 converged into a crisis that revealed the full extent of Operation Ajax's long-term consequences, because the Iranian state, though heavily armed and externally supported, had lost its ability to command genuine loyalty across society. And when economic shocks, rising expectations, and political exclusion intersected, the mechanisms of repression that had sustained the regime for decades proved incapable of containing a mass movement that framed its struggle not only against the Shah, but against the historical humiliation embodied by foreign intervention. And as protests spread and repression intensified, the memory of Mossadegh's overthrow resurfaced explicitly in slogans, speeches, and underground writings, invoked as the moment when Iran's chance for democratic self-determination had been stolen, and this framing gave the uprising a coherence that transcended class, ideology, and generation, allowing disparate groups to unite around a shared narrative of betrayal and resistance. And for American officials watching events unfold, the speed and scale of the collapse were shocking, because they had long equated military strength and intelligence penetration with stability, underestimating the corrosive effect of illegitimacy on a political system. And when the Shah ultimately fled the country, it marked not just the end of a monarchy, but the unraveling of a strategic architecture built in the aftermath of Operation Ajax, exposing how dependent that architecture had been on a single ruler whose authority rested on foundations laid by a covert intervention decades earlier, and the revolutionary government that emerged defined itself in explicit opposition to the legacy of foreign domination, placing the coup at the center of its historical narrative and using it to justify a radical reorientation of Iran's relationship with the West. And this reorientation reverberated far beyond Iran, reshaping regional politics, disrupting energy markets, and delivering a severe blow to American influence in the Middle East, at a moment when the Cold War was entering a volatile new phase. and in retrospect, the arc from 1953 to 1979 revealed a pattern that Cold War strategists had repeatedly failed to acknowledge: that the suppression of democratic processes in the name of stability often produced not lasting order, but delayed upheaval, with consequences more severe than those the intervention had sought to prevent. And as historians and policymakers later reassessed Operation Ajax, it came to be seen not merely as a successful coup, but as a case study in the limits of covert power, illustrating how tactical victories could generate strategic defeats over time. And this reassessment gained further weight as declassified documents confirmed the depth of foreign involvement, removing any remaining ambiguity about the operation's authorship and intent. And yet, even as the historical record clarified, the ethical and political questions raised by the coup remained unresolved, because acknowledging responsibility did not undo the damage inflicted on Iran's political development or repair the mistrust that had become entrenched between Iran and the United States. And within the broader Cold War narrative, Operation Ajax stood as an early warning that would largely go unheeded, demonstrating that the manipulation of sovereignty and democratic choice carried costs that accumulated silently until they erupted with transformative force. And this lesson, though rooted in a specific time and place, echoed across later interventions and debates about foreign policy, challenging the assumption that stability imposed from outside could substitute for legitimacy generated from within. And as the Cold War drew toward its end, the shadow of 1953 remained visible in the strained and adversarial relationship between Iran and the West, a relationship shaped not by ideology alone, but by memory, grievance, and the enduring impact of a covert action that had altered the course of a nation's history, leaving behind a legacy that continued to influence global politics long after the immediate imperatives of the Cold War had faded. In the years that followed the Iranian Revolution, as the Cold War entered its final and increasingly unstable phase, Operation Ajax began to acquire a second life, not as a classified success story, but as a historical reference point invoked repeatedly in debates about intervention, sovereignty, and the credibility of Western power, because the rupture between Iran and the United States could not be understood solely through the lens of ideological extremism or regional instability, but had to be traced back to the moment when Iran's political trajectory was forcibly redirected. And this reinterpretation mattered because it challenged the dominant Cold War narrative that framed covert interventions as defensive necessities rather than formative acts with enduring consequences. And within Iran, the memory of 1953 became institutionalized through education, media, and political discourse, not as distant history, but as a living explanation for mistrust, reinforcing a worldview in which foreign involvement was assumed to be manipulative by default. And this assumption shaped Iranian responses to later crises, from regional conflicts to diplomatic negotiations, creating a persistent feedback loop in which suspicion limited compromise and confrontation reinforced suspicion. And for American policymakers, this legacy proved difficult to confront, because acknowledging the full implications of Operation Ajax required grappling with the uncomfortable reality that some of the most damaging outcomes of the Cold War were self-inflicted, the result of choices made in pursuit of short-term advantage without sufficient regard for long-term political development. And as archival material continued to emerge in the late 20th century, the image of the coup as a clean, efficient operation gave way to a more complex picture of improvisation, miscalculation, and unintended escalation, revealing that success had depended as much on contingency and internal Iranian dynamics as on careful planning. And this realization undermined the myth of omnipotent covert power that had shaped intelligence culture for decades, exposing the limits of external control over deeply rooted social and political forces. And yet, even as this understanding grew among scholars and analysts, the broader pattern it represented remained deeply embedded in international practice. Because the temptation to manipulate outcomes discreetly rather than engage with messy political realities persisted long after the Cold War's ideological urgency had waned. And in this sense, Operation Ajax functioned as both an origin story and a warning, illustrating how the tools of covert action, once normalized, could become substitutes for diplomacy and compromise, narrowing the range of acceptable policy responses. And the Iranian case was especially stark because it demonstrated how the removal of a single leader could derail an entire democratic experiment, altering not only domestic governance, but a nation's identity and its place in the world. And this alteration could not be reversed simply by changing leaders or policies, because it was embedded in collective memory and institutional practice, shaping how future generations interpreted both internal authority and external pressure. And as the Cold War ended and new frameworks of international order were debated, the unresolved legacy of 1953 continued to cast doubt on claims of moral authority advanced by those who had once justified the coup as a defensive necessity, reminding observers that the line between protection and domination was often defined by perspective rather than principle, and that the consequences of crossing that line could persist long after the strategic context that motivated the decision had disappeared. And in reflecting on Operation Ajax as a Cold War event, its significance lay not only in its immediate outcome, but in the way it revealed the structural tensions of an era defined by fear, rivalry, and the willingness to subordinate democratic ideals to perceived security imperatives. A pattern that would repeat itself in different forms across the world, leaving behind a legacy of instability and mistrust that outlived the bipolar system itself. And in this way, the coup in Iran stands as one of the Cold War's most consequential quiet battles, fought without declarations or armies, yet decisive in shaping the political landscape of an entire region and the enduring relationship between a nation and the global powers that had once claimed to act in its defense. As the Cold War receded into history and the bipolar order that had framed decisions like Operation Ajax dissolved, the Iranian coup of 1953 increasingly stood out not as an anomaly, but as an early signal of how power would be exercised in an era defined by fear of ideological loss, because it revealed a willingness to treat democratic processes as expendable when they conflicted with strategic or economic priorities. And this willingness, once normalized, became a quiet constant beneath the shifting rhetoric of containment, development, and stability, shaping interventions large and small across the globe. And in the Iranian case, the clarity of hindsight made the consequences impossible to ignore, because the overthrow of Mossadegh had not eliminated instability but deferred it, compressing decades of unresolved tension into a later explosion whose scale and intensity far exceeded the risks that had originally been cited to justify intervention. And this pattern underscored a central paradox of Cold War strategy, that efforts to control outcomes through covert force often undermined the very predictability and order they sought to preserve, especially when those efforts targeted political legitimacy rather than external threats. And for Iran, the destruction of constitutional politics in 1953 removed a pressure valve that might have allowed grievances to be addressed incrementally, leaving repression and revolution as the only remaining paths. And when revolution eventually came, it did so with a depth of popular participation and ideological intensity that reflected decades of accumulated resentment, not merely opposition to a single ruler or policy, and this depth made reconciliation with the United States extraordinarily difficult, because the conflict was rooted not in misunderstanding, but in a shared historical memory of intervention and betrayal. And even as later American officials expressed regret or acknowledged involvement, these gestures could not undo the formative experience that had shaped Iranian political consciousness, demonstrating that acknowledgement without structural change rarely satisfies demands for justice or dignity. And within the broader Cold War historiography operation, Ajax thus occupies a unique position, because it forces a confrontation with the limits of power exercised in secrecy, challenging the assumption that outcomes achieved without public accountability can be managed or controlled over time, and it highlights the asymmetry inherent in such interventions, where decision-makers bear little immediate cost, while affected societies absorb consequences that unfold across generations. And this asymmetry complicates traditional assessments of success and failure, because what appears effective in the short term may prove destabilizing in the long run, a reality that Cold War institutions were often ill-equipped to measure or anticipate. And as scholars reassess the era with access to declassified records, the narrative of benevolent containment gave way to a more fragmented and morally ambiguous picture, in which Operation Ajax emerged as both a tactical achievement and a strategic caution, illustrating how the pursuit of dominance could erode the moral foundations upon which influence ultimately depends. And in the end, the significance of the 1953 coup lies not only in its immediate impact on Iran, but in what it reveals about the Cold War itself, a system that incentivized intervention over understanding and secrecy over accountability, producing outcomes that continued to shape global politics long after the ideological struggle that justified them had ended. And in this sense, Operation Ajax stands as a reminder that the Cold War's most enduring battles were often invisible at the time they were fought, their consequences unfolding slowly, embedded in memory, identity, and mistrust, waiting to reassert themselves when the structures built to contain them finally gave way. When viewed from the long arc of 20th century history, Operation Ajax reveals how the Cold War's logic transformed fear into policy and policy into precedent, because what began as a specific intervention justified by concerns over oil, influence, and proximity to the Soviet Union, evolved into a broader acceptance of covert regime change as a legitimate instrument of statecraft. And once this instrument proved usable in Iran, it reshaped institutional thinking within Western intelligence and political circles, encouraging the belief that complex societies could be steered from the shadows through calibrated pressure, rather than engaged as political communities with their own trajectories and constraints. And this belief proved resilient, even as evidence accumulated that such interventions carried unpredictable and often destabilizing consequences. And in Iran, the outcome was particularly stark, because the coup did not merely replace one leader with another, but reoriented the entire relationship between state and society, severing the link between political authority and popular consent, and replacing it with a system sustained by surveillance, force, and external backing. And this reorientation altered how Iranians understood power itself, fostering a political culture in which legitimacy was measured less by procedure than by resistance to domination, a shift that would later empower movements capable of mobilizing mass participation against a heavily armed regime. And from the perspective of Cold War strategy, this outcome exposed a blind spot that persisted for decades: the assumption that ideological alignment and military capacity were sufficient indicators of stability, when in reality, legitimacy and memory exerted a far greater influence over long-term outcomes. And the Iranian case demonstrated that memory in particular could function as a strategic variable, accumulating silently and resurfacing at moments of crisis with transformative force. And as Cold War archives were opened and official narratives revised, Operation Ajax came to symbolize the gap between intention and effect, highlighting how decisions made under the pressure of perceived existential threat could reverberate far beyond their immediate context, shaping identities, alliances, and hostilities long after the original rationale had faded. And this realization complicates any simple assessment of the coup as success or failure, because while it achieved its immediate objectives, it simultaneously planted the conditions for a future rupture that would undermine the very interests it was meant to protect. And in this sense, Operation Ajax stands as one of the Cold War's most instructive episodes, illustrating how power, exercised without accountability, can secure compliance but not loyalty, order but not legitimacy, and how the suppression of political choice in the name of security can ultimately produce a far more profound and enduring insecurity, one rooted not in external threats, but in the unresolved grievances of a society whose history was forcibly redirected. And as the Cold War ended and new forms of global rivalry emerged, the lessons of 1953 remained unresolved, lingering as a cautionary reminder that the true consequences of covert action are rarely immediate and never confined to the moment of intervention, but unfold slowly, shaping the future in ways that defy control and resist erasure. In closing, Operation Ajax endures as a defining illustration of how the Cold War's internal logic converted uncertainty into intervention and intervention into long-term consequence, because the overthrow of Mossadegh did more than resolve a short-term strategic dilemma. It demonstrated that the preservation of influence was often prioritized over the preservation of political legitimacy, a choice that carried deferred costs invisible to planners focused on immediate outcomes, and in Iran, those costs manifested as a deep rupture between state and society that no amount of modernization, military strength, or intelligence control could fully repair, because legitimacy once broken is not easily restored, and the memory of how it was broken can become more powerful than any narrative imposed afterward. And as decades passed, the coup ceased to be merely a historical episode and instead became a reference point through which subsequent events were interpreted, shaping attitudes toward authority, foreign involvement, and the meaning of sovereignty itself. And this interpretive power explains why 1953 continued to matter long after the Cold War context that produced it had vanished, because it represented not only a loss of democratic possibility, but a lesson about vulnerability, that even lawful popular movements could be overturned when they conflicted with external interests. And this lesson hardened into mistrust that structured Iran's relationship with the West and constrained the possibilities of reconciliation, ensuring that future interactions were filtered through suspicion rather than confidence. And for the architects of Cold War policy, the Iranian coup thus stands as a paradox, a textbook example of effective covert action that simultaneously undermined the very stability and influence it was meant to secure, revealing that control achieved through secrecy and force is inherently fragile, dependent on conditions that cannot be sustained indefinitely. And when those conditions change, the suppressed history returns with amplified force. And in the broader sweep of Cold War history, Operation Ajax illustrates how the era's most consequential decisions were often those made quietly, justified by fear and executed without public scrutiny, yet capable of reshaping nations and relationships in ways that outlived the ideological struggle itself. And as such, the coup in Iran remains a cautionary marker in the Cold War record, not because it was unique, but because it exposed with unusual clarity the limits of power exercised without consent, the dangers of mistaking short-term alignment for long-term stability, and the enduring impact of interventions that succeed operationally while failing historically, leaving behind a legacy defined not by victory, but by unresolved grievance, mistrust, and the irreversible redirection of a nation's political path.